Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another Artex Academy webinar. Today, we're talking about cooling dry cows and the impact that has on cows and the calf. We're here today with Jeff Dahl from the University of Florida. And I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited about your presentation. And if you have any questions, you can ask them at the bottom of your screen. There's a question and answer button, or you can do so through the chat. We'll take the questions at the end and Jeff will answer them. So thank you very much and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So we're going to be talking about cooling dry cows and the effects on the cow and the calf. And just to give you a little bit of the setup for the presentation, for the first part, I'm going to talk about what happens when cows in late gestation, so from dry off to calving, are subjected to heat stress, the effects on milk yield in the next lactation, some of the metabolic consequences during the dry period, but also in early lactation, effects on immune function, and talk a little bit about placental function as well as some of the drivers for the negative impacts that we see of that heat stress and the persistent effects. And then, of course, placental function leads into questions about the calf as well. And so we've done some work over the past 10 years or so looking at the impacts on that calf, both early in life and particularly related to immune status in those animals, and then as they grow, and then finally on their performance in their first and second and third lactation, and then beyond that, effects on their offspring as well. So a lot of impacts of this heat stress during the dry period on cows and also their calves. So just to give you a little bit of a setup here, this barn probably looks a little bit like some of the ones that we saw in that video that started the presentation. This is where we do all our work. And just to show you, it's not anything special. It's a sort of typical sand-bedded freestall barn, like many of you would have or have seen. The only difference is here in Florida, we don't have these things on the side called walls. Ours is just a roof over those sand-bedded stalls, but we do have fans over the stalls, and we also have soakers over the feed line. So we do get quite a bit of heat stress here in Florida, as you might expect. But as we go through, I'll point out that we get a lot of heat stress in a lot of North America. So it's not as if we're the only ones who get heat stress. But I think that what I'm trying to do here is just show you that the data that I'll present are all generated from this type of facility, so should be relevant to most production facilities. And just by way of introduction of how we actually induce heat stress, these fans come on at about 70 degrees, and our soakers come on for 1.5 minutes every 5 minutes when we hit 72 degrees. And the way that we induce our heat stress treatment is just turning off the fans and the soakers for the pen that those cows are in. So they're still shaded, they're still in a sand-bedded stall, but they don't have access to that active cooling, those soakers and the fan. And that leads to pretty profound heat stress, at least in our hands. And so just to give you a sense of why we get heat stress in those animals, this is just an illustration of sort of a 24-hour cycle of temperature and humidity in one of our barns. So you can see early in the morning, somewhat lower in terms of temperature, although still fairly warm. We peak, obviously, in the sort of mid to late afternoon, and then that's going to gradually decline through the evening hours. The dotted line or the dashed line is actually looking at relative humidity, and this is really where it's a killer for us. We end up with pretty high humidity at our time of lower temperature, but this is going to make it more difficult for those animals to actually get rid of heat. And so our humidity is going to be lower, relatively lower in the afternoon, but that's when we have our higher temperature. So by not allowing animals access to active cooling, we induce heat stress pretty readily, even in a barn environment. And what that leads to is elevations in rectal temperature, also leads to elevations in respiration rate. These are just data from one of our studies, very similar to all the ones that we've done. We'll see something of a separation in the morning, typically in rectal temperature between our two treatments, the heat stress versus the cooling. and that becomes significant in the afternoon. And typically we're looking at 4 to 5/10 of a degree on average increase in rectal temperature in the animals that are heat stressed versus the animals that are cooled. Now that may not seem like a lot, but remember, we induce our heat stress treatment from the time the animals dry off, and then they're on that throughout their dry period. And all of our studies, except for the one I'll mention later on, we've looked at this in mature cows, so second lactation and greater, and we can induce heat stress pretty readily for that entire dry period. And our target for dry period length is about 45 days. So they would have been exposed to heat stress for a solid 45 days between the time that they're dried off and the time that they calve in. And when we do that, what happens is first noticeable in milk yield in the next lactation. So these open symbols here are the cows that were heat stressed when they were dry, in comparison with the cows in the solid squares that are the animals that were cooled when they were dry. So typically we're looking at about an 8 to 10 pound a day increase, so 4 or so liters a day increase in milk yield in the cows that are cooled versus those animals that are heat stressed during the dry period. It's important to point out that from a management perspective, during lactation, all of the cows are going to be cooled. So we don't persist with these treatments after the animals calve in. They're all going to be managed identically after they calve in. They're all calving at about the same time. So there's no real explanation management-wise once they're in lactation for these differences in milk output. The only difference is that we manage the cows differently back here during the dry period with these cows that were in the open circles being heat stressed for that entire dry period versus the animals that were cooled. So always good to see results of one study, but what we want are multiple studies showing the same type of thing to ensure that we have a true effect. And these are all of the studies, at least that I could find in the literature, looking at this response, with the exception of one recent one that I'll talk about in first calf heifers as we get a little further along in the presentation. But I think that you can see the solid bars are the cows that are cooled versus the open bars, which are the cows that were heat stressed when they were dry. And in every case, the cows that were cooled when they were dry made more milk in that next lactation versus the animals that were heat stressed. So a very consistent response in the animals with cooling during the dry period, increasing milk yield in that next lactation. So we wanted to know, what the basis for this was, particularly at the level of the mammary gland. Because it's a persistent effect on milk yield, we thought that obviously the mammary gland was going to play a role in this. And if we think about milk production from the perspective of the mammary gland, it's really a pretty simple equation. It's going to be a function of how many of those secretory cells are in that mammary gland that produce milk, and then how hard they work, so their metabolic rate. And because this is an effect that we see at the beginning of lactation and it persists, it's more likely that it's going to be an influence on the number or the capacity for milk secretion in that mammary gland rather than the metabolic rate of those cells. And if we think about epithelial cell number changes, again, pretty simple equation. You can get more cell growth, which would lead to higher numbers of epithelial cells, or we can slow the cell death down in those epithelial cells, which will also lead to greater capacity for milk yield in that next lactation and persistency of milk yield. So we looked at this in one of our studies with a series of mammary biopsies during the dry period, but also into lactation. And the first thing that we observed, and this was about 3 weeks after the animals had dried off, about 3 weeks before they were calving in, we saw that the animals that were cooled had much higher rate of proliferation, so of mammary growth, than the animals that were heat stressed. And this is in the epithelial fraction, so those cells that are actually going to be producing the milk in that next lactation. We looked at the stroma as well. This is kind of connective tissue and sort of non-secretory tissue in the mammary gland. Similar pattern, didn't quite reach significance. But when we look overall, the proliferation, the mammary growth of those animals that are cooled is much higher at about 3 weeks before calving than that of the animals that are heat stressed. So this is suggesting that there is going to be greater capacity in that mammary gland in the next lactation to support higher output. But of course, we had to look at the other half of the equation, which is cell loss. And that's termed apoptosis. It's just a definition is really cell death. And we looked at this in the epithelial fraction as I've presented it here. And we see that at that same time point I just presented, about 3 weeks before the cows calve in, there's no difference in the loss of cells at that time. There's an increase, there's greater turnover right around the time the animals calve in. But again, there's no difference between the two treatment groups. It's not as if the animals that are cooled are losing cells at a slower rate than the animals that were heat stressed. And even out into lactation, there's no difference. So that, along with the effects on proliferation, suggests that there's going to be greater capacity of that mammary gland to produce milk in that next lactation. And some other data that we have is that we've looked at alveolar numbers. So these are the sort of sub-organ type L's that are going to be producing, or structures, excuse me, that are going to be producing milk. So these are the functional units of secretory cells here shown in this H&E stained section. And what we observed is that the cows that are cooled actually have greater alveolar numbers than the animals that are heat stressed. So consistent with greater capacity of that mammary gland to produce milk in the next lactation. So some of the questions that come up from a management perspective then have to do with how long we actually have to cool cows before they are going to show these responses. And another one that I used to get quite frequently was do spring and heifers sort of potential first lactation animals have to be cooled prepartum, and will we see any of these positive outcomes? So let's just take a look at some data that we have on those two questions. This question about how long the animals actually need to be cooled during the dry period came up quite frequently. And so we took our cows and applied that treatment of cooling to them from dry off, or heat stress from dry off. And you can see that we had our increase in rectal temperature in the cows that were heat stressed versus those that were cooled. We also saw that they had a greater respiration rate. So just as we would have expected. About halfway through the dry period then, we took half of each one of these groups and we moved them to the other treatment. So now we ended up with 4 total treatments in this study. We had cows that were cooled for the entire dry period, cows that were heat stressed for the entire dry period, animals that were cooled the first half of the dry period and then went to heat stress, and animals that were heat stressed for the first half of the dry period and went to cooling. And so you can see that the rectal temperature and the respiration rates are all consistent with what we'd expect when we heat stress animals. Both increase. And we saw those when they were on those heat stress treatments versus the animals that were on the cooling treatment. So another thing that we've sort of been starting to investigate is effects on placental function. And we know that cows that are heat stressed are going to calve earlier than animals that are not heat stressed. And so that's an indicator of reduced placental function. And this study was no different. When we look at gestation length, and then of course dry period length is going to be a function of that, we see that the cows that are cooled have longer gestation length and dry period length relative to the animals that were heat stressed for the entire dry period. So we do see some reduction in gestation length in those animals that experience heat stress. What was interesting was both of the groups that were the switch groups, the ones that went from cool to heat stress or heat stress to cooling, it didn't matter. When they were heat stressed for 3 weeks out of that 6-week dry period, we found that those animals all had a lower gestation length and a lower dry period length than the animals that were cooled the entire time. But these 2 groups, or these 3 groups, weren't different. So any heat stress at all seems to have a negative impact on those animals from a gestation length perspective. Then of course, that's going to be an indicator of reduced placental function. And we've got some other studies or some other data that show more clearly that those animals do have reduced placental function. And when we looked at the milk production responses, not surprisingly, based on those effects on gestation length, there was a difference the animals that were cooled for the entire dry period here in the open boxes made more milk, just like we've seen previously, relative to the animals that were heat stressed for the entire dry period. But both of our switch groups here were not different from the animals that were heat stressed for the entire dry period. So that's consistent with that effect on gestation length, and suggests then that we need to have animals cooled for the entire dry period from dry off until they calve in again in order to realize the benefit of this response. Another question that came up was about first calf heifers. Would there be any advantage to cooling those animals? The first thing that we looked at was the effect of cooling heifers for the last 60 days of gestation on their respiration rate and rectal temperature. And you can see here the respiration rate was increased with heat stress versus the animals that were cooled for the last 60 days. And rectal temperature was also elevated in those animals that were heat stressed versus the cows that were cooled, the heifers that were cooled for that same time period. And then perhaps not surprisingly, when we looked at milk production, the animals that were cooled for the last 60 days of gestation had higher levels of milk yield than the animals that were heat stressed for that final 60 days of gestation. So consistent with what we see in the mature cows, when we cool those heifers for the last 2 months before they calve in, we're going to realize some benefit from a milk production standpoint with those cows producing right around 8 to 10 pounds a day more than the animals that were heat stressed. So of course, it's not just about milk production. We've got to have some other systems that are going to be supporting this. So we wanted to look at the metabolism of these animals. And the first step is gross metabolism, which is indicated by dry matter intake. We see that when animals are heat stressed during the dry period, they consume less feed than the animals that are cooled. And that's very consistent across studies when we've done this. So even though they're at a relatively lower level of dry matter intake compared, for example, with lactating cows, we still do see a reduction in intake in the cows that were heat stressed versus those animals that are cooled. After calving, there's no real difference in intake between the two groups, but this is just for the first 6 weeks or so. I suspect that given those changes in milk yield, that those animals are going to have some sort of splitting as we go further out into lactation. We just haven't tracked it out that far, but at least early on, it looks like they maximize their intake in both groups. And if we look at body weight changes, those are kind of consistent with the lack of differences in intake in the two groups after calving. However, the animals kind of dry off at the same weight in this study, and we see that the cows that are heat stressed in the open symbols, they kind of maintain their body weight during the dry period, whereas the cows that were cooled actually had a little bit of an increase in body weight. They were definitely higher than the animals that were heat stressed. And then after they calve in, we see that that reverses. The cows that were cooled actually have greater body weight loss than the animals that were heat stressed. And that's consistent with what we see from a milk production standpoint. The cows that are cooled are making more milk. There's not really a difference in feed, yet they do have the capacity to sort of mobilize tissue reserves in order to support that higher level of milk yield. We've looked at concentrations of insulin in our cows and metabolites, glucose, and non-esterified fatty acids. During the dry period in this shaded portion here, you see that there's no real effect on circulating insulin, even though we did have those differences in intake. There's no real effect on glucose, and there's no effect on circulating non-esterified fatty acids. So in contrast to what you may be familiar with from studies done with lactating cows, we don't drive these animals into a negative energy balance with our heat stress, probably because they're not making milk at the same time. So we don't see changes in insulin or in glucose or circulating NEFAs until we get very close to calving. And I think that this is more of a response to that higher level of milk production in the cows that are cooled rather than any direct effect of the heat stress per se on those animals. So no real direct impact metabolically on the cows except for that gross dry matter intake difference with the heat stress during the dry period, although there are some carryover effects in that next lactation. Turning now to taking a look at some of the effects on immune function, we know that cows are at the greatest risk for acquired disease when we dry them off and when they calve in. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing from a production standpoint didn't exacerbate that problem and make it worse from an immune standpoint. So we've looked at this in a number of ways. First one was kind of a gold standard test tube type assay to look at immune status, lymphocyte or white blood cell proliferation. This is during the dry period when the animals are either experiencing heat stress or they're actively cooled. And we see that the cows that are cooled actually have improved lymphocyte proliferation, suggestive of greater immune status than the animals that are heat stressed. We also looked at another aspect of acquired immunity, their ability to produce antibodies in response to a pathogen, for example. And in this case, it wasn't a pathogen, it was just a foreign protein, egg white, in this chicken egg white in this case, but they will have an immune response to that. And we see that during the dry period, when the animals are either heat stressed or cooled, there's definitely separation, with the cooled cows having a greater response to that immune stimulus than the animals that are heat stressed. After the cows calve in, there's no difference in their responses. It's obviously a different physiologic state, but it's important to remember too that all these animals were cooled at this point. But certainly when they're heat stressed, there is a separation here, and that may have some implications for some of the vaccination protocols that we put cows through during the dry period, with improved responsiveness perhaps in the cows that are cooled versus those that are heat stressed. Shifting over to the innate immune function. So this is just kind of first line of defense, the sort of rapid response that we have with neutrophil infiltration into a tissue problem where a pathogen might be resident. Again, the shaded area is during the dry period, whereas the open area is after the animals have calved in. We did not see a difference in the oxidative burst, which is their ability to kill, or the phagocytosis, which is the neutrophil's ability to sort of capture or grab onto a pathogen during the dry period. So there's no direct impact on innate immunity of the impact of heat stress during the dry period. But after the cows calved in, there was definitely a separation, and we've shown this in a couple of studies now. The cows that are previously cooled actually have improved neutrophil function, both from a burst perspective and also a phagocytosis perspective, relative to those animals that had been heat stressed. And this is despite the fact that those animals are mobilizing more non-esterified fatty acids, probably in a bit more severe negative energy balance because of that higher level of milk output at this time, yet it doesn't seem to adversely affect their ability to mount an immune response. So we wanted to look at what the sort of downstream effects of that would be, both from a disease standpoint, but also from a reproductive performance standpoint. Hard to do that with a controlled study, so we had to take a little different approach. And what we did was look at records on one particular farm as good management, very consistent feeding and management. And we looked at the records of cows that were dry during the hottest months of the year. So they would have had their entire dry period sometime between June and August. And then we matched those to cows that were genetically similar that had their entire dry period during the cooler months of the year, December, January, February. And we just made a comparison both from a production standpoint, also disease and reproduction. So in terms of milk production, we found that the cows that were dry during the hottest months of the year produced less milk than the animals that were dry during the cooler months of the year. So that's consistent with our controlled studies. And then looking at disease incidence, the 0 just means that they didn't have the disease. The 1 means they did. And in the case of mastitis, in the case of respiratory disease and retained membranes, we found that the cows that were dry during the hot months of the year actually had greater disease incidence than the animals that were dry during the cooler months, which is consistent with some of the indicators of immune status that I showed you from our controlled studies. This digestive disease incidence was a little elevated in the animals that were dry during the cooler months of the year. We think that that may have been due to some more cases of ketosis, which would have been consistent with higher levels of milk production. But you can also see that even with that, they didn't have higher incidence of any of the other diseases with that increase in digestive disease. So they seem to be able to manage that quite well when they are cooler during the dry period versus the animals that are heat stressed. Looking then at reproductive performance, the cows that were dry during the hottest months of the year ended up having poorer reproductive performance, more breedings to settle, days in milk were elevated to get to pregnancy and to breeding, excuse me, and also to pregnancy relative to the cows that were dry during the cooler months of the year. And the other thing to realize with this is that these cows that were dry during the hottest months of the year would have been being bred during cooler times of the year relative to these animals that were dry during the cooler times of the year. So if anything, we should have seen poorer reproductive performance from an acute heat stress standpoint in these cows, yet we did not see that. The cows that were dry during the cooler months of the year had better reproductive performance versus the animals that were dry during the heat stress time. So just to sort of sum up the effects of late gestation or dry period heat stress, we know now from a number of studies that we're going to see a decrease in milk yield. That's going to be a result of reduced mammary growth. That's probably resulting from altered placental function in those cows that are heat stressed versus the cows that are cooled. And we also see some effects on immune function, both during the time those animals are heat stressed, but also carryover effects into that next lactation, which we would want to avoid. So it's particularly because of this altered placental function, we thought it would be of interest to look at what's happening in that developing calf when she experiences heat stress for the final 6 to 8 weeks of development in utero. And we've looked at that, like I said, early in life and then through the sort of growth reproduction phase and then into lactation in those animals as well, with some pretty interesting outcomes. The first thing that we did was take a look at birth weight. And as I said previously, cows that are heat stressed typically calve in a few days earlier, and they're going to have lighter birth weight calves versus the animals that are cooled during the dry period. This has been shown before. Certainly some of that effect is the few days shorter gestation length, but also a major part of that effect is going to be that reduction in placental function and efficiency of transport of both nutrients and also gases by that placenta in the animals that are heat stressed versus the animals that are cooled. And this has been shown before, but it was good for us to sort of confirm that in our studies. What hadn't been looked at was how long this effect persisted. And so we looked at weaning weight and found that that difference persisted with the calves that were born 2 months or so earlier to cooled dams being higher weaning weight than the animals that were born to heat stress dams. This isn't really a body weight change difference. It's really sort of a persistence of that difference in birth weight in those two groups of animals. With the heat stressed animals being lower at weaning than the animals that were cooled or from cooled cows. Perhaps a greater interest is the impact on immune status. So we looked first at total IgG in circulation in the calves from the two groups. And this is in one of our early studies. And you can see quite clearly that there's a difference from the first day of life after these animals had received their colostrum, higher circulating IgG in the calves that were born to cooled dams in the solid symbols versus those animals that are born to the heat stress dams. And that persists through about a month of life when we stopped measuring it, but certainly through the time when their own immune competency is increasing. So it's a really important time for those animals, obviously, to have gotten good uptake of IgG. And when we look at this, it seems to be that the difference is really in their capacity to actually absorb immunoglobulins from the colostrum that they're fed, because they all got the same amount of colostrum, they all got it within the same few hours after birth, yet those heat stressed animals seem to have a lower apparent efficiency of immunoglobulin absorption relative to those animals that are from cooled dams. It's not really an effect on the concentration of IgG in the colostrum, but they just seem to have lesser uptake of those IgGs that are in the colostrum. So we wanted to look at this a little bit more in depth to really nail down whether this was an effect on the colostrum or whether it was an effect on the calf itself, because they might offer different ways to manage them if it was an effect on colostrum versus an effect on the calf itself. So to do that, we just took animals from our typical 2 treatments. We had calves that were born to cooled cows and a group of calves that were born to heat-stressed cows. And then instead of giving them their mom's colostrum, we fed them from the same pool of colostrum, a large pool of good quality colostrum that we produced. And the calves all got the same colostrum, regardless of whether they'd been heat stressed in utero or cooled. And then we saved the colostrum that the cooled dams produced and made another pool. Same thing with the cows that were heat stressed during gestation. So now we've got a pool of heat-stressed colostrum and a pool of cooled colostrum, and we fed that to 2 groups of calves that were born under thermoneutral conditions. So here we're looking at eliminating any difference in colostrum. We're looking at an effect on the calves. In this second study, the calves are all born under thermoneutral conditions, and we're trying to look at differences, if they exist, between the colostrum that these cows produced on the different treatments. So for the first study, when we looked at birth weight, as expected, the calves that were born to heat stress dams, lower birth weight, and as we had shown before, they have a lower weight at weaning as well. So just like we expected. We also started to get some indication of what type of growth these animals were experiencing. The calves that are born to cooled dams tend to be taller during that pre-weaning phase. And we think that that's an indicator of improvements in lean growth or lean mass accretion versus these animals that are born to heat stress dams. And we've got some other data that would support that idea as well. And then when we looked at apparent efficiency of immunoglobulin absorption, again, very similar to our previous experiment. The calves that were born to cooled dams, greater IgG absorption than the animals that were born to heat stress dams. And that's despite the fact that they all got colostrum from the same source. So this appears to suggest that the calves that are born to heat stress dams have some difference in their capacity for immunoglobulin absorption. And then we looked at results from our second study. So these are the calves that are all born under thermoneutral conditions, yet they're fed colostrum from a heat stress dam or a cooled dam. You can see there's no difference in birth weight. We didn't expect there to be. No difference in weaning weight. Really no difference in any of these growth variables that we'd observed through weaning versus the first experiment. And then when we looked at IgG absorption, again, no difference in immunoglobulin uptake in the calves that received colostrum from a heat stress dam versus from a cooled dam. So that suggests that it's not an effect on colostrum, it's an effect on the calf itself. And it's going to be very difficult to sort of manage our way out of that after the animal is born. And in some follow-up studies, we've shown that there is an acceleration, it appears, of gut closure in the animals that are born to heat stress dams versus those animals that are born to cooled dams. So similar to the field studies that we did with the cows, we wanted to look at some sort of downstream events in these animals to see if there are other aspects of growth or reproduction or production that were affected. In order to get the number of data points that we needed, we had to combine records from a number of studies that we did. These are the studies on the cows, and they produced a reasonable data set, a number of animals for us to look at effects in the calf. So we ended up with about 150 calves total, similar sort of 70 to 75 calves in our group from cooled dams versus heat stress dams. We did have a little bit of a higher proportion of heifers because we were doing some sex semen work with IVF at our farm at that time. But as you can see, they're balanced between the two treatments. So that really didn't have an impact on what we were looking at. And we did look at some of the early life effects in the bulls as well as the heifers, but really it was this group of heifers that it was primary interest in this first analysis. So looking at the overall data set, similar to what I showed you before from one of our studies, calves that are born to cool dams, higher birth weight than calves that are born to heat stress dams. And when we looked at the effect of gender, bulls in both cases are going to be heavier than heifers. Nothing earth shattering there, nothing surprising, but we wanted to confirm that we were seeing what we expected to see in the full data set. As I said before, this effect on birth weight is very consistent. Heat stress causes lower birth weight. We had confirmed that the animals are going to have lower weaning weight. And then when we track those heifers all the way out to puberty or a year of age or so, we see that that separation persists. So the calves that had a year before been born to a cooled dam, higher body weight than the animals that a year before had been born to a heat stress dam. So very consistent that we see this separation of body weight up to a year of age. We looked at survival of those animals, trying to get a little better handle on what the outcomes of the immune status differences would be. Just focus in here on the heifers that left the herd before puberty. When we look at our cool treatment, many fewer heifers leaving due to sickness and other issues versus those animals that were born to heat stress dams. So again, those sort of early life immune status effects seem to be borne out in those calves leaving the herd sooner. And so we end up with fewer of those calves born to heat stress dams actually making it through their first lactation relative to those animals that were born to cooled dams. And then looking at reproductive performance, very low numbers here, but all of them sort of leaning towards the positive for the calves that are born to a cooled dam versus those animals that are born to a heat stress dam. Services per pregnancy were lower, age at pregnancy a little bit lower. We probably lost one or two of these pregnancies earlier because they were pregnant at a younger age. And it ended up that we didn't see a difference in age at calving between the two groups, but nothing to indicate that calves born to cooled dams have poorer reproductive performance despite their more rapid growth and other positive events earlier in life. And then looking at milk production in their first lactation, significant reduction in the animals that are born to heat stress dams versus those animals that were born to cooled dams. So just to set this up again, the calves here at 2 years of age in their first lactation were born to either a cooled dam 2 years earlier or a heat stress dam. And so there's a significant reduction in milk yield, 4 to 5 liters a day in those calves when they calve in for the first time that were born to heat stress dams versus those born to cooled dams. And this is a persistent effect all the way through lactation. So our first question was, are there differences in genetic potential between the two groups? And we looked at that and there were not. The next idea that we had was, well, maybe these calves that are born to heat stress dams, they were smaller at birth, they were smaller at a year of age, lighter body weight at calving, maybe they would have some compensatory growth in that first lactation and catch up for future lactations. And I think that you'll see in this slide that that was not the case. They had already caught up from a body weight standpoint. So at calving, there was no difference between the two groups of animals. So between a year and 2 years of age, they had caught up in terms of body weight, not necessarily stature, but certainly in terms of body weight. And then there was no difference in body weight between the two groups all the way through that first lactation. So it wasn't that the calves that were born to heat stress dams were sort of catching up from a growth standpoint and would be okay in that second and third lactation. They didn't have any difference in their body weight accumulation during that first lactation. And then when we looked at the survival of those animals, this is a larger data set now. We've continued to collect this information beyond that first study. And we found that the animals that are born to heat stress cows actually leave the herd at different stages at a more rapid rate and don't survive as long as the animals that were born to cooled dams. And not only that, but they seem to pass this on to their offspring. So the calves that were born to heat stress dam, their calves leave the herd more rapidly than the calves that were born to cooled dams. So this is a persistent effect in those animals of the heat stress that their dam may have received in utero. And then when we look at production, as I said, these are sort of it's a larger data set, but showing exactly what I showed you before in terms of the production lag in those animals that were heat stress versus cooled. It's still there in the second lactation, and it's still there in the third lactation. So those animals are going to be lower productivity throughout the time that they're in the herd if they've experienced heat stress in utero versus the animals that were cooled. So last little bit that I want to talk about is some of the economic analyses that we've done. You know, does this pay off to cool our dry cows? Is it worth it? First thing we had to do was kind of estimate the total effect, potential effect of heat stress on the herd. We did this for the top 23 milk producing states in the US. Obviously, a state like Florida or Texas, Georgia, not unexpectedly, we have well over 2/3 of the time a year are potential days when we're going to experience heat stress. So a lot longer duration of potential heat stress. But I think what is probably of interest to the larger group is that it's not like we don't experience some heat stress throughout the US. And so even as we get a little further north, we're going to experience up to 30% of the year when our cows are potentially heat stressed. And so if we then calculate that back to the percentage of the herd that might be heat stressed during the dry period, it's a significant impact even in our more northern states. So we did a net present value analysis trying to look at what might make sense in terms of investment to actually build a new barn, for example, to house our dry cows in. Sort of a sensitivity analysis here across different milk prices, different expected production responses in that next lactation, and different costs on a per stall basis to put up a barn. So just trying to get a handle on when we might want to consider making this investment. So anything above a 0 here should be a pretty rapid payoff relative to below 0, where it's going to take, it's not going to be as good a financial decision. And if we look across all of these treatments, really the only one is this very low level. So a kilo or a liter a day, 2.2 pound production response at that level milk price, at that stall price. It's going to take us a long time to pay that off. Really, this would make sense somewhere like Florida, Georgia, Texas perhaps, but maybe not in the rest of the country. But across these other sort of responses, and these are very typical of what we've seen in our studies, it's going to cross that 0 point pretty early on. And in fact, this red line is dropped here at the average number of heat stress days across the US. So we're going to make a good financial decision in many cases by getting those cows into a facility where they have adequate cooling. Then if we just have to retrofit a facility, if we don't have, for example, fans and soakers in our dry cow barn, and we want to make that investment, well, that's going to make a lot more sense. And essentially any of these scenarios are going to pay off quite rapidly for those animals to actually be cooled more effectively when they're dry versus the animals experiencing heat stress. So couple of points with this analysis. The only thing we looked at was that milk production response in the next lactation. We didn't look at any indicators of disease like I showed you in some of the studies, and nothing with regard to the calf effect either. And so when we started to include those, it makes even more sense to get those cows cooled off. Here, same states that we looked at previously in terms of milk production. And we just looked at various aspects of the response in terms of cost of heifer rearing productive life for those animals, because we do see differences in how quickly they leave the herd, and milk production responses. And here you can see that in a place like California, our biggest milk production state, we're going to see significant loss on an annual basis, over $110 million a year. But in many of our states, we're going to see $20 to $30 million potential loss every year by not cooling those dry cows. So certainly should cause you pause and get you thinking about how you're going to effectively get those cows cooled off during the dry period. So just to sum up then, sort of the whole presentation is really focused on getting these cows in late pregnancy cooled off. It's going to have positive effects during the dry period. We're going to see that those animals that are heat stressed actually have a change in placental function. They're going to have lower intake and impairs mammary growth, and that leads to lower milk yield in that next lactation. But perhaps even as important or more important are the effects on that calf that's developing in utero. When her dam experiences heat stress, she experiences it as well. And that leads to early life effects, lower birth weight, lower IG absorption, weaning weight, survival rate. And ultimately, she's going to be a lot less productive in the herd over her lifetime in the herd versus the calves that are born to cooled dams. So these programming effects, these sort of influences, fetal programming are going to really persist in those animals, and they're all negative. So with that, just want to thank all the students and my primary collaborator the last 6-7 years, Jimena Laporta, now at the University of Wisconsin, for her help, and students' help for the projects that we did. Some other collaborators here, and of course the folks that have funded a lot of the work that I presented today. And with that, be happy to take any questions that might be in the chat box, but I can't see the chat box, so I guess Karen's going to have to tell me those questions.
So we do have one in the question and answer section.
Okay.
Somebody was asking how many cows were in the Febreze study. And so I'm not too sure which slide that was applied to.
Yep. So I think they're asking about the study where we switched cows from heat stress to cooling, or cooling to heat stress, kind of halfway through the dry period. And we had in all of those studies, we kind of shoot for between 15 and 20 cows in those treatments, and that would have been similar for that. So we would have had, I believe it was between 16 and 20 cows in each of those groups at the end of the study.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So how would you go about cooling cows in dry lots with shade and no fans or soakers? Yeah. So it works. I've seen it work pretty well to actually take advantage of what we might have for cooling capacity in a holding pen, for example. Sort of walk those cows up to a holding pen, get them soaked in between milkings, and then have them go back to their dry lot environment, and they'll cool off. Works very well in sort of more arid environments. Have those animals come up, even though we're moving them a few times a day. That additional sort of walking or exercise doesn't seem to hold them back. And all reports, at least from sort of field studies on that, show that those cows tend to do better in that next lactation versus just leaving them and not trying to get them cooled off at all. So I think this next one applies to the study that you were just talking about. Were the cows in constant groups until the end of the dry period?
So the cows that were in all of our studies, we're either going to have them cooled or they're going to be heat stressed from the time they dry off until they calve in. And the only difference would be in that one study where we switched half of each of those groups to the other treatment halfway through the dry period. But then they were only in those treatments. They didn't sort of go back and forth.
So what was the increase in milk yield during lactation for cooling first calf heifers during late gestation?
It was in the order of 3.5 to 4 liters, I think. That study just came out in the Journal of Dairy Science, so that should be available, at least in abstract form.
All right. That looks like the end of our questions. We've got a poll that's up just to let us know how we did today. Oh, wait, we just had a question come in. Any other suggestions on cooling cows in dry lots?
You know, just as much as you can, make sure that those animals have good access to shade. Make sure that we've got the basics covered, that those animals have good access to water 100% of the time, good clean water, and as much as possible, try and get them cooled off any way that we might be able to. Even if we can only do it 2 or 3 times a day, that really makes a difference to drive down those temperatures, and it seems to have an impact on them in that next lactation.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us around the world. And we appreciate you coming out, Jeff. This was a great presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
All right. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.